Hello, everyone, and welcome to our UN Behavioral Science Week session on behavioral science and decision-making in the UN. So my name is Mary McLennan. I am the Senior Advisor in Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I also lead the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I will come to shortly. So the group, the Behavioral Science Group, excuse me, is organizing UN Behavioral Science Week, which is taking place, of course, this week. We have 5 days of events. 46 entities coming together and over 60 speakers. So there's lots to check out outside of today as well. So just to give you a sense of some of the sessions that are to come, there's a lot on AI and behavioral science and data, also on thinking about expanding our methods taking place on Thursday. We all have one on a lot of practical case study examples from our expos taking place on Thursday and Friday as well. So lots more to check out throughout the week if you haven't seen the agenda already. All right, so a little bit about the Behavioral Science Group. So we bring together over 7,000 members from more than 70 entities in 150 countries. So there's quite a lot of interest, need, and demand when it comes to behavioral science across the UN, and as reflected by the group. And you can also join the group if you are outside the UN as an observer. You can get invited to our events, hear about some of the work that we're doing as well. So we'll put some of those links in the chat for you shortly if you haven't joined the group already. All right, so also to share here, why we're talking about behavioral science, there's lots of things you'll hear about the week in terms of its importance for innovation, for impact, for decision-making, as we'll discuss today, as well as for just simplifying what we do. But really a big push behind our efforts the last few years has been this UN 2.0 quintet of change. So these are 5 areas the Secretary General has deemed important for the UN to be nimble and effective and really deliver on its ambitious agenda. So we have behavioral science included there, along with data, digital transformation, innovation, and strategic foresight. And we'll hear about some of those intersections across the areas of the quintet in our discussion today. Okay, so as I mentioned, we'll put in the chat some of the links to our resources. We have the Secretary General's guidance note on behavioral science. We have the UN Behavioral Science Review. We have a practitioner's guide to getting started with behavioral science in the UN. So lots to unpack. And also the link to join the group as well. If you haven't joined already, there's lots more to take place following the week. And if you join the group, you can keep engaged with us to ensure you stay up to date. Okay, so how today's session will be run. So we'll hear from a panel of speakers, and we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And if you don't have a question yourself, you can still see the questions of others in the audience and upvote those. So hopefully we have a discussion that's really tailored to our audience today. So check out the Q&A box while presenters are speaking and in between presenters. It really helps us to have a meaningful discussion with those who've joined us today. Okay, so with that, we have our speakers for today. So first we'll start with Andrew Leigh, who's from the Government of Australia. And he'll be speaking to some of the importance of evaluation and the work that they're doing in Australia. Second, we'll hear from Gina Lucarelli, who's actually unfortunately not on the slides, but you will definitely get to see her live shortly. So she is from UNDP Accelerator Labs, and she's done a ton of work over the last few years thinking about experimentation and how that can be embedded into the work of the UN. Then we'll hear from, actually next, Leonard Klein from CRAF'd. He'll talk about some of the decision-making, how we can improve decision-making through a better understanding of data and taking that into account. And then finally, we'll hear from Adan, Brian, Julia from UNAIDS, WTO, and OIOS about some of the work in terms of evaluation and behavioral science and how we can integrate behavioral science in that way. So with that, I'm going to stop screen sharing and turn it over to remarks from Minister Leigh. So unfortunately, well, he's in Australia, obviously. This is not a great time zone for him. So he's sent us some remarks over video. So I'm going to share those now.
G'day, my name's Andrew Leigh, the Assistant Minister for Treasury in the Australian Government. As is normal in Australia, can I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we're meeting and pay my respect to their elders and to all First Nations people present. Happy UN Behavioural Sciences Week, and thank you to Mary McLennan for the opportunity to deliver some opening remarks. Here in Australia, behavioural sciences have been important to how we've done policy making for a long time. A behavioural sciences unit at the heart of the Australian Government was set up following the example of the UK Nudge Unit. And in 2023, the Australian Government set up the Australian Centre for Evaluation, a unit within Treasury which focuses on expanding the quality and quantity of high quality evaluations across the Australian government. The Australian Centre for Evaluation has a particular focus on randomised trials, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Randomised trials have transformed medicine, moving from the old eminence-based medicine, in which the expert wisdom of grey beards was all that mattered, to evidence-based medicine, in which what mattered was which medicines worked best. That saw careful, rigorous randomised trials of treatments such as tuberculosis and the polio vaccine, saving countless lives. In the rollout of healthcare, randomised trials have been important too. The debate over whether it was better to get people to make co-payments for malaria insecticide treated bed nets was finally solved through a series of randomised trials conducted in different low-income nations. Those randomised trials showed clearly that when people received a bed net, but they hadn't made a co-payment, they were just as likely to use it, and that far more people got bed nets when there was no requirement to pay. That then changed policy across the developing world and has gone on to save many lives in the area of malaria treatment. We're seeking to do the same in the area of policy, bringing rigorous randomised trials to areas such as disability care, employment and education. The Australian government is working in partnership with other governments around the world that have focused on how to better use randomised trials. We're inspired by the example of the Education Endowment Fund in the United Kingdom, by the work that the Arnold Foundation has done in funding a series of randomised trials across social policy. We've benefited from the Global Commission on Evidence report put together at McMaster University in Canada, which has shown how all of us can better use evidence. And recently, the OECD hosted a one-day roundtable put together by Australia on how randomised trials and the better use of evidence can be deployed. Work is already ongoing to better combine evidence syntheses across like-minded countries. Work akin to that which has been done in the past by the Cochrane collaboration and the Campbell collaboration. Better synthesising evidence is integral to the production of evidence. We need not only to have high-quality evaluation, but also to distill those evaluations so policymakers can make better decisions. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of the things the Australian government is doing and the ways in which countries can better work together to use evidence. I'm wearing today my I Love Evidence badge, and I hope that similar passion for evidence can permeate more countries. If our work can be useful to you, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Thanks again, and happy UN Behavioural Sciences Week.
All right. So are we going to have our evidence badges at the end of today's session? Let's see. Thank you for your remarks, Minister Leigh. Great to have those with us to kick us off for today. Lots of claps and hearts coming in through the Zoom function now. Next, over to Gina Lucarelli from UNDP Accelerator Labs to share some thoughts on this. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and hello, everyone. So great to see such a good turnout. Thank you so much for organizing Behavioral Science Week. I always joke that it's as regular in the spring as having to file taxes as an email from Mary inviting me to this. So it's really wonderful to see, and I'm looking forward to the panelists. I just wanted to kick off today by offering a bit of reflection on evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based policymaking, evidence-based decision-making. This is something that I think you all, being in this webinar, taking your time to be here, are committed to. But I do think it requires a little bit of unpacking, because in today's kind of very fast-paced, complex environment where we're dealing with wicked problems, evidence-based policymaking and decision-making, the theory of change behind them, that better data leads better decisions and will lead to better outcomes for people and planet. There's a lot that comes in between those two elements, those three elements, right? That better data, better decisions, and better outcomes. So I wanted to offer three aspects of evidence, three characteristics of evidence that need to be in place in order for it to be used by decision makers and by people. The first is it needs to be there when you need it. The second is it needs to be trusted and accepted. And the third is that it needs evidence itself in today's sort of constrained environments, particularly in global development, needs to have a return on investment. So let me unpack that a little bit. Evidence needs to be there when you need it. Those of you who joined yesterday may have heard my colleagues, Lazar Ivanov and Christian Pada, who are heads of experimentation inside our accelerator labs in North Macedonia and Paraguay, respectively. They talked a bit about how we in the UNDP Accelerator Labs, which is a network of innovation teams in 114 countries, what we do is we try and balance speed and rigor when it comes to experimentation. We're called Accelerator Labs, not because we're driving the growth of startups, but because we are accelerating learning for sustainable development. So we're trying to speed up that learning cycle for sustainable development. So when we use experimentation to create evidence, we need it to be there when it matters for people making decisions, right? So that can be as easy as if you're trying to impact United Nations programming, the evidence needs to be there at the stage of design, right? If you are trying to impact government resources and budgeting, it needs to be there during the budgeting cycle, right? And not a moment later. We actually find we're starting to do some work looking at our work in crisis context. And the Accelerator Labs, are in 114 countries. They're in 75% of what we call crisis countries. And what we actually see is one of the innovation methods. We use a whole suite of innovation methods, but one of the innovation methods that is used most in crisis contexts is behavioral insights and ethnography. This is really used to kind of understand local motivations and constraints and pain points, and to understand how crises kind of shape the daily lives of people, given how quickly context can change in crisis. So the first thing I have to offer you is that evidence needs to be there when you need it. And we seem to be finding that even in crises, behavioral sciences and ethnography more broadly are quite useful to understand how things are working. We see this in work in Sudan, looking at hate speech, also in Syria on hate speech. We see this also in Syria on looking at women's inheritance issues. So it's quite a relevant method, even in context of crisis. The second aspect of evidence that I wanted to explore here is, in order to be used for decision-making, evidence needs to be trusted and accepted. And one of the things that we are learning, with this large network of innovation labs inside the UN development program, is that in order for evidence to be accepted or trusted, it often helps if people collect it themselves. So we've done quite a bit of work using citizen science, which is sort of, broadening who does the research, right? Instead of a few highly skilled researchers doing, large scale trials in multiple places, this is larger groups of people doing smaller trials, but that are comparable, right? Using some kind of data standard, using, open source software and tools to compare results. So I want to share with you one example, which actually doesn't come from our network, but it does come from some research that we've done on collective intelligence for climate action, which is indeed where we kind of picked up this point that something about when people collect their own data makes them more likely to act on it. Essentially, this is a piece of work from CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, and it's a piece of work called Seeds for Needs. And basically what they're looking at is trying to figure out which seeds work under the context of the changing climate. So changing rain patterns, extreme temperatures, et cetera. What works for farmers in actually growing food. So what they've done is, in 14 countries, they have 50,000 farmer scientists who plant seeds and see what happens and record data, again, using a light touch data standard and some open source software. What they actually find is that the results of those those kinds of experiments where we have more people conducting smaller experiments seem to have a higher rate of trust and reliability than the official government seed lists, right? The official government seed approval list. So understanding which bean varieties work in the context of changing rain patterns, there's something about having the farmers collect the data themselves that then makes it more trustworthy for other farmers. And so I offer this to you because we talk a lot about evidence-based policymaking, evidence-based decision-making, and I do think there is something we need to do in terms of democratizing who collects data, who analyzes data, because we might have a better chance of it getting acted on if we take it from there. The third point I have to offer you is, and this is my last point, those on my team know I always have three, is that evidence, in order to be used for decision-making, needs to have a return on investment. So I say this because, so when we started the UNDP Accelerator Lab Network back in 2019, very early on, we actually were graced to get an award from Apolitical. We were chosen as the public service team of the year when it came to evidence-based decision-making. And I always thought that was kind of funny because I felt we hadn't really done anything yet to deserve it, but of course we were happy to have the award. I also thought it was funny because I didn't think of us as Accelerator Labs as really in the evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based policy-making sphere. Where we are now is we do have these 90 labs reaching 114 countries, and they're all running experiments to try and generate new forms of evidence. One thing that we've done in the past 2 years is to try and create a return on investment for the generation of new forms of evidence. So behavioral science is one form of new evidence that we create. We use multiple other ones, and you can kind of check out our website to see the sort of broad suite of innovation methods that we use. Essentially, what we found is we sat down and we tried to figure out, okay, how can we convince our investors that using experimentation to create evidence is actually worth their money? Especially because we're very often getting the feedback, you do these small scale experiments, it's too small. The problems are very big and we need to be operating at scale. So we thought, okay, let's look at the scaling rate of our experiments, right? As a way of instilling investor confidence and creating a sort of return on investment. So taking inspiration from our lab in Lesotho, who actually started doing this, and then we scaled it up globally to all the 114 countries. We developed a way to measure whether or not our experiments have had any result, have been used in any way. And essentially what we look at is, has it influenced public policy? So for example, in neighboring Eswatini, the team did an experiment on banning single-use plastic bags, then it ended up becoming policy. The experiment phase enabled people to react to what it would be like if there was a ban on single-use plastic bags, what kinds of entrepreneurship it would actually generate among women in creating cloth bags, that sort of thing. But eventually an experiment became policy. So that's one way that we measure scaling. The other way we measure scaling is whether or not it's been picked up by the UNDP, by government, and scaled geographically. So we've seen this, for example, recently in Ecuador, where they've done some work creating digital memory maps to create a human face to victims of femicide. And this piece of work has actually been taken to scale almost throughout Ecuador by being integrated into training for judges and prosecutors, which has reached many areas of Ecuador. So having an experiment get picked up by UNDP, by government, by UNDP in its own programming, by government in their programming, or scanned or scaled geographically is another way we measure scale. We also look at whether or not the experiment generated new partnerships, brought in new resources for development, or has embedded even a new way of working, right? It might be that the results of your experiment, it's not that policymakers act how you wish they would in the first instance, but they might actually just adapt the way of working, right? They might not necessarily follow the dictate of the results of the behavioral experiment, but they may, pick this up as a general way of working. So this is what I wanted to offer you, just a couple of thoughts on evidence-based policymaking, evidence-based decision-making, especially because at the moment we're doing a lot of work on looking at information integrity and looking at information ecosystems, how information circulates in the world. And there's a lot for us to think about and experiment on and figure out when it comes to the connection between how information moves around the world, how people actually make decisions, and what people actually do with evidence once they have it on their hands. So thank you so much, Mary, for this opportunity, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists.
Hey, thank you so much, Gina, for those remarks and really bringing it back to the UN context in so many ways. The importance of really thinking about the timing of it, having how to make evidence meaningful, then also like the return on investment. I think so. I put in the chat there, seeing lots of hearts coming through. They're really, really loving your remarks, Gina. I put in the chat the Accelerator Labs website, but I know you've done some work on experimentation recently as well. Anything else on that space I think would be particularly interesting for this audience too. If anything else you want to share in the chat. But thank you very much for those remarks. Really set us off in a good space to continue our discussion today. Thank you, Gina. Next, over to Leonard from CRAF'd. Over to you.
Yes, I cannot thank Gina enough. This is really the perfect setup for the work that we're doing at CRAF'd. But hi, I'm Leonard. I'm the Data and AI Analyst at the Complex Risk Analytics Fund. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we can integrate behavioral science into that data ecosystem. So I'll just quickly share my slides here. Right. Hope you can see them. Okay, perfect. All right, so without further ado, what do we do at CRAF'd? So we finance, connect, and reimagine data that saves lives. What does that mean? Financing means that we need a sustainable financing basis for data and how it's being procured. But connecting also means bringing different people together, just like Gina mentioned, the farmers that are collecting the data, or like on the local level, or the local communities, but also different actors from academia, from the UN system, from all people that might be using the data or might be collecting it. And also to reimagine, which means sort of rethinking how we collect this data, but also how behavioral science might come in to improve the data ecosystem overall. And if we zoom out a little bit, why does this matter? So if we know that at least 42 billion in international aid are spent every year, if we could only improve 1% through optimized data-driven decision-making, that would already mean that 420 million would have like a more targeted effect for people and the planet in crisis-affected areas. So this is a huge, important potential here. And this is exactly the return on investment that Gina mentioned as well. And just like I said, this was really the perfect setup, because this is the theory of change that was mentioned before of evidence-based decision-making, right? So we have the data and analytics that ideally improve the resource allocation of crisis data and like crisis action, which would then lead to earlier, faster, and more targeted action, and then in the end, for more lives and livelihoods saved. But of course, this always seems like a bit of an abstract automatic process, but it really isn't. There's something in between here, because it's a human process. Decision-making is not just something that happens. It's something where you have decision makers, look at the data, make decisions, and then you have these outcomes. And this is exactly where behavioral science comes in. Because what we know from behavioral science is that people are not just a machine that takes data, rationally processes it, and then comes up with decisions, right? We have all these different complicated processes on how we actually deal with data and how we come up with decisions. And for example, cognitive biases can be a huge issue here. How we process data might already be influenced by what we perceive about the world, how we think about the world, what perspective we come at the table with. And so we need to be mindful of these processes. Also, information overload. Just because there's a beautiful dashboard doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful for the decision-making process. So we need to be mindful of that as well. And then, of course, if you don't have the statistical literacy, the best data set, no matter how the quality is, will not necessarily lead to better decisions. And then also there might be a lack of incentives, and that we have to be aware of as well. Within an institution, not necessarily to take up the data that is available to really drive better decisions. Unfortunately, also on the data side, we see that the ecosystem currently is dysfunctional and not very conducive to driving effective human decision making. And that's exactly what we see in our analyses as well, that it's fragmented, often incomplete, unfortunately quite unreliable and inconsistent, and especially relevant here, that there's a weak link to decision making. And it's really lacking in actionable insights. So even if the data is available, it's not necessarily linked to the important decisions that have to take place. And also, we don't really see that standards and best practices, for example, from behavioral science, are implemented in the way that data and analytics are structured. So ideally, we would take these into consideration and then really sort of set up a structure for data and for analytics tools that keep behavioral science in mind and to better enforce and optimize decision making. And how do we do this? Well, at CRAF'd, we think that if we pool the funding behind the data and use a prioritized investment process, we can drive a better, more functional crisis data ecosystem, which is connected and complete, which is more sustainable and reliable, and importantly, has sort of more insightful and direct link to decision making. And also, because we can bring people together, we can discuss sort of the standards and conventions that we would like everyone to follow when collecting data or when procuring a data set. We can also introduce best practices from behavioral science on how the data is structured. So for example, if we were to use a standard on how different variables are named across different data sets, which would allow for more interoperability, which then creates a sort of richer picture of the situation on the ground. This would also allow decision makers to more easily identify sort of what to look at and to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity. Or on the side of a dashboard and crisis analytics dashboard, for example, to really take the evidence that we have from behavioral science on how to best present information that is sort of less likely to be interpreted in a biased way. So these insights can really drive forward better decision making. And we're excited to sort of be at a site where we can bring a better ecosystem into the world, especially in a more sort of funding constrained environment that we see ourselves in here. Driving down costs and being more efficient by pooling funds is really important. And so if you would like to join us on our mission as a data financer, come reach out to us and learn how you might be able to invest smarter through CRAF'd. And then as a data and insight provider, you can partner up with us for greater impact and bringing together your data and your analytics tools with other, which would overall sort of have these network effects and flywheel effects. And then also as a crisis data champion, as we like to call them, so people who are actually on the ground making decisions, connect with us online to learn how we can work together more and what else we're up to. So thank you very much, and very much looking forward to the discussion later as well.
Great, thank you for that, Leonard. Getting lots of claps and hearts for you as well. A really interesting initiative, and we guys can put in the chat the link to CRAF'd. I think colleagues would like to hear more of it. And really interesting. I think there's a session taking place later this week. Well, I know there's a session taking place on Thursday on behavioral science and data, which might pick up on some of these topics too. But really interesting point. And some of the comments there about in the chat about what you said at the end regarding sort of cost-constrained environments and the importance of evidence and data use in this context. So really interesting you touched upon that as well. I feel like that's a theme that is coming out throughout the week we might touch upon in our Q&A too. So thank you for that, Leonard, for being with us and bringing this perspective to the discussion. Great. Okay. So next on to our speakers regarding evaluation. Adan, I believe, is first.
Adan, yes.
Over to you.
Oh, sorry. Here I am, Mary. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone, and thank you for inviting us to this session. My name is Adan Ruiz. I'm the Director of Evaluation Office at UNAIDS. That's the joint program that fights AIDS through 11 agencies in the UN. with a secretariat. I'm also co-chair of Eval Partners, which is a partnership between 56 evaluation offices in the UN and all the voluntary organizations of evaluation across the world. And why do I say that? Why is it important that we have this in mind? Because of the profession that we, as evaluators, is a profession that really touches upon evidence and upon policy and decision making across the world, not just the UN. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to share my screen. There are in any year in the UN, there are more than between 200 and 2,200 evaluations, up to 5,000 evaluations per year. So it's a really huge industry on evidence, and that is important on regards of what's happening, how it's done, and what is the quality of this how it's done. It's important to understand, and for those of you who are not evaluators, that evaluation is part of a cycle. It's an intervention with an intervention. So in the small square on the left, you see the typical evaluation, program with design, development, resource mobilization, implementation, and evaluation. Well, the evaluation within the program has its own intervention and its own rationale. So it starts with terms of reference, it starts with data collection and design, and then there is, of course, the evaluation report, and then there is dissemination, and so on and so forth. So what have we observed in the last 20 years as practitioners? Well, as evaluation practitioners, we observe that the standard evaluation process, which is the one on the right top, the circle on the right top of the screen, it's
Sorry, Adan, could you go full screen with your slides? It might just be easier for us to see.
Thank you. Yeah, great. It's better now. So yeah, so the right circle on the top right of the screen, that's where we can see the intervention with intervention that is an evaluation. And this is important because in this circle, in this intervention, we have observed in the last 20 years a lot of frictions, and this cycle is prone to human biases. So the important thing is that, well, in a few years ago, and just last year, we also had another session here in the Behavioral Science Week. We presented an approach that Julia Engelhardt at UNAIDS developed. That is called an enable, and this approach tries to tackle the biases, identifying them through the evaluation process in the different stages of the evaluation. And when I say tackle them, it means that we try to apply nudges for each of the identified behaviors, or not behaviors, but biases that we have identified across the different the phases. Phase 1, commitment; phase 2, diagnostics; and phase 3. So my colleagues, Brian and Julia, will present some examples of how we have applied in this approach in phase 2 and in phase 3. And I will talk a bit about what we have done in the phase 1, in commitment. That's when we designed the evaluation. And when we designed the evaluation, there are a couple of things that we normally do, and that's something that standard approach is to establish a evaluation reference group, which basically is around 15 stakeholders that comprise the major agents with a stake in evaluation. The problem with these groups is that we found consistently a couple of problems: group dynamics and thinking biases, and polarization. So that there is an element here where evaluations tends to go slower, and there are disagreements. And this is not just because of political struggle. but or institutional struggle is because there is a lot of biases into the discussion of different type of biases, and this impacts in the quality and the time that we provide our services. So just one real quick example of how we have tackled the problem with group thinking and power dynamics, and this amplifying polarization and amplifying errors in terms of group thinking. Well, we have used in our approach and evaluation framing, and in framing there are two different types of framing. The first thing is to make sure that the questions on the agenda are technical and they are substantive, and they have a practical value to the conversation. So that allows for a discussion that limits itself to the realm of technical and professional thinking. The other thing is that we have made, instead of 13, 14, 20 people in the same group, we have made sure that we have different smaller groups when dealing with the design of evaluation. And in these 3 or 4 members of a group, we have different meetings. So the discussions are more, they are less noisy in terms of political struggle, and we simplify also the decision structure for the meetings to happen. So in this, basically at the end of this first commitment, the first phase, we end up with the terms of reference of an evaluation that are agreed upon, and they are ready for now the implementation phase, which I will pass the floor to my colleague Brian. He will provide an example on that session, on that phase of the evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Can everyone hear me? I had some technical issues before.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Just bear with me. Okay. So can everyone see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining the session, and I'm very delighted to be here today. So I work for the Inspection and Evaluation Division of the UN's Office of Internal Oversight Services. However, what I'm going to present today is a result of an experiment from my previous role in the Canadian government in collaboration with academics from Harvard and UCLA Berkeley. My hope is that this serves as an example of a practical, low-cost intervention that could be applied by almost anyone seeking to communicate more effectively. So we tested 5 different survey invitations to 30,000 people to see if certain messages would lead to higher open rates. But before I jump into the experiment, it's important to speak to the problem we were trying to address. As much as we all want to help and answer surveys, we are bombarded daily with requests to provide feedback for all the different products and services in our professional and personal lives. In short, many of us are overwhelmed or have little patience, especially with long and confusing asks. The reality is that when people are overwhelmed with so many requests, they often ignore them. And what this means for evaluators and researchers is that we may miss out on getting key feedback. So to tackle this problem, we ran an experiment and applied the scientific method to really test this. A little bit about the program we were evaluating. It was an incentive offered by the Government of Canada to provide support to first-time homebuyers. While we had physical addresses on file, we didn't have any emails. So this was a major challenge for us. However, we did the best we could with what we had, and we sent out 30,000 physical letters to people with a QR code to try to invite them to access the survey. We knew this would be an uphill battle, as it required the individual to physically open a letter, read it, and not immediately throw it into the trash or, best case, recycling. So I'll pull up the 5 conditions now that we tested. Note that what you'll see on the next slides, the only thing that changes is what's inside the purple box. Everything else stayed the same. Also noting that this was Canada, so the message is in English and French. So this is the first condition. So it was about seeking input regarding experiences based on our standard messaging we use normally in an evaluation to invite people to do a survey. Second condition, helping us or the government improve the program. This approach was based on acknowledging the experience of having used the program to best provide the government with feedback. Third one, don't be left out. This approach was based on the idea that we are currently talking with relevant stakeholders to get their feedback. If they didn't participate, they would miss their chance to have their voice heard. Fourth, ingratiation. This approach aimed to show that we understand how difficult purchasing a home is in today's market and congratulated users on this achievement. And fifth, and finally, helping other program users, which in some sense is a form of altruism. This approach was appealing to the good nature of people and their willingness to share feedback to help those in a similar position. So those are the 5 conditions we tested. To administer the experiment, we randomly divided the population into these 5 groups, around 6,000 letters per condition. So here are the, again, a lot of information quickly, but here are the 5 conditions we tested. Mary, I don't know if it's possible now to initiate the poll. It'd be interesting to run our own little experiment now. I'd like to ask everyone to vote. Which do you think did best? And I can't see the screen, so Mary, feel free to end the poll whenever and let me know what the results are because I can't see it.
Maybe let's wait 10 more
Sure.
seconds. Then I'll end the poll. That's a signal to the audience. You have 10 seconds or else you'll not be included in this. Okay, I'll end the poll now.
Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing number 3 was the highest, followed by number 4, then number 5. Interesting. Okay. So now we'll go to the results. So before we go there, just to preface it, so the way it's organized is on the left, you'll see on the next slide, the winning condition. Then everything to the right is relative to that condition in terms of % fewer survey opens. So here are the results. So what we did see was that number 3 and number 1 were the 2 highest, number 3 being the highest, though there was no statistically significant difference between the first 2, number 3 and number 1 versus those 2, but everyone else was statistically significantly less, and you can see that there. Now, the question of why this might be, we can turn to behavioral science. There's been a lot of literature describing loss aversion as a very real thing. By framing things as something missed instead of gained, we tapped into the cognitive bias. Another thing at play is the bandwagon effect, which is the idea that people are more willing to do things knowing that many others are doing it. Another way to think about this is about FOMO, or fear of missing out. So those are our theories for why condition 3 won. But in terms of condition 1, why did that do well? Our thoughts was that research has shown that people are more responsive to simpler communication and clear calls to action. So overall, our results align with what one might expect from behavioral science. However, much more work is needed in the area to be helpful to test whether we can repeat these results and see differences internationally. This might have been a unique Canadian phenomenon, or maybe that can be applied internationally. Some other things that would be interesting to test are on the slide here, although we don't have time today to go through it. I'm hopeful that this has been helpful in providing a tangible example of how adjusting communication can yield very different results, and how failing to leverage these insights could mean missing out on significant opportunities to influence positive change. So now I will pass it over to my colleagues. Thank you. And I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Brian. Lots of claps and thumbs ups in the chat. Julia, would you like to come in to share some remarks?
Yes, hello. Hi, Mary. Thank you very much. And this is in continuation to what Adam actually and Brian has already mentioned. As Adam mentioned before, we worked together in our past life in developing this framework for evaluations. And the reason why we did that is because actually we realized that a lot of the recommendations we were providing or the work we were doing in evaluation obviously is aimed to improve actually the way we work. And most of those recommendations actually are aimed to be strategic and procedural. So this is why Adam and me, we started realizing that we were missing maybe some of the key insights of our work in terms of how we can influence decision-making to produce the change if we weren't including behavioral science in our process. Now, in continuation to that, this is I am going to explain a little bit, just one simple example, not overly complicated, in how we are trying to factor in the past examples of behavioral science into the recommendation process. So here, as I mentioned before, so usually evaluations were aimed to improve decision-making or influence decision-making in organizations. And one way we used to do that is actually, trying to look at the strategic, providing strategic guidance or also procedural recommendations. But at times we realized that, we were missing actually the real root cause of the problems as evaluators. And this is, for all of us evaluators, sometimes we forget to look into the behavioral issues because of lack of time or pressures of delivering, quick results. So one of the things we intentionally did was to integrate behavioral science into the evaluation process. Not just at the end of it when we're writing the report, but right at the moment when we start designing the recommendations. And the good reason for that was that, traditionally, as I mentioned, the recommendations would not really follow that sort of process. And very few evaluations will systematically look at, behavioral issues and how people act or decided or react in real life situations. And because our recommendations sometimes did miss this mark, we may be addressing a symptom, but not the real root cause. So let me give you a quite simple and concrete example of a past issue that we found. As I say, there are many, many issues, but because of the lack of time, we are just going to one simple case. So let me say, we are looking at compliance of, a procurement contract. And these are very simple things that can be costly to organizations of any sort. And you might find this in every place, especially I think nowadays in the times of crisis. I think it's important to, organizations are becoming more and more efficient and trying to look at simpler ways on how to reduce costs and to improve efficiency, right? So, you have a contract process, and usually in every organization in the UN, as being one of the persons that have worked in the UN, we have our rules, we have our policies, we have our processes on paper. And we always assume that because there are all these things in place, everyone is going to follow this the moment when the rules or the policies are published, right? But reality is different. So people really do not stick to those rules and policies, not because they are bad people, but because there is a lot of time pressures at work, because, we don't perceive like there is a big risk if we do something that, not in line with the rules, or because we are just used to. How often do we not come across people who, and you try to, change a process and people say, but we always did it that way, so why bother? So that's a reality. So we just need to, as evaluators, we need to have in mind that because something is written, it's not necessarily, people are going to do it, or follow what is on paper. So this was, in one case, as I mentioned in the past, and let's say you have a contract and the rule says, below 50,000 or above 50,000, you're supposed to follow a certain process, and most people wouldn't do it. So what we did in my previous job was to actually include a process in automatized nudge, which you all probably are familiar with this type of automatized nudge. And we would mention to people at the moment when they were going through the process, if the threshold was above 50,000, we say, please be reminded that, all these contracts above 50,000, we will take a sample for verification, and you might be among that sample. So already that simple message that would come, during the process did decrease the number of people that really was, were not following the rules. And in the fact, we realized that actually it was not longer necessary to keep reminding people about the rule. It was just more important to automatize the system with a very simple solution. Now, it might look like a, very insignificant way to nudge people, but in reality, this type of solutions, when it comes to the right moment in evaluation or audit process, what it does, it also decreases the, let's say, the potential risk of having fraud. Also, it reduces the amount of audits that will need to be carried out as well as investigations in any organization. So de facto, we are trying through those small nudges that cost us actually nothing really in terms of cost, because the automatization process was done very easily. But in terms of the cost that it could create, the not following of certain procedures was really considerable. So now, going back to, what we are trying to do now in evaluation is to try to include through the nudges more preventive measures, ways of, avoiding that the problem occur, and that we come as a solution after a problem has occurred, but rather reducing the likelihood of issues arising during a process. And in this way, I think, we are trying to make the systems more efficient without having to create fears among the staff, because I think that's also the beauty of nudging, right? That you don't have to be reminding people every time, this is a rule you have to follow, but rather doing it without really changing, the usual process dramatically in a way that people will start sensing, over controlling systems or and start fearing about, the system. So I stop here because I am conscious about the time. And if you need to know anything, how we do this in more complex studies, we have other examples too. So just to contact us. Thank you, Mary.
Great, thanks for that, Julia, and thanks for the comprehensive look at evaluation in behavioral science. So lots here to unpack. We can put some resources in the chat for you. So we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to invite all of the panelists to turn their cameras on. We'll go through a quick question, which seems to be a theme that's coming out throughout the week and the session. So I'm going to combine two questions. First of all, lots of interest in Accelerator Labs, Gina. So thank you for responding to all those questions. People can collaborate and work with you. But there's one, the most highly voted question is, high quality evaluation. We can think about that term broadly, what evaluation means, data or experimentation or standard quote unquote standard UN evaluations. High quality evaluation is one of the first things to be sacrificed when funding is scarce. What does this mean for the work of the UN? And there's also a question on, do we ever evaluate the impact of evaluations, right? So if we're going to invest this time and effort to do this evidence generation, to what extent is there value in that? So I'll leave those big ideas with you. Who wants to come in first on this? Yes, Leonard, please come in.
Yeah, maybe on the topic of funding for me to come in. So I think I do agree that people sometimes see data and evidence as nice to have, right? That's just like a nice add-on. And I think that's just not true, right? Because if you don't really know what's out there, and if your programs have a real impact, then you're just driving in the dark without a navigation system. And that's how we like to think about it. Like, data really is the navigation system for us to navigate a complex environment and to have a real impact. So I think what we're trying to do now is to bring the different data silos from all the different organizations together into a shared funding environment so that it's more reliable and sustainable, and so it doesn't just get cut if funding is more constrained. So that would be my answer there. But yeah, happy for other colleagues to come in as well.
Thanks, Leonard. Yeah, anybody else would like to come in on this topic of, yeah, Adam, please come in.
I just wanted to maybe try not to answer, but to respond or to react to the impact of evaluation. This is something that it's a question that has been there forever, and forever hasn't been clearly answered, in my view. If you take a look at the literature out there on the impact of evaluation, is very limited, scattered, and doesn't really answer the global question: is evaluation, having an impact or not? So we can only have anecdotal references, and that's something that we have experience in as practitioners. But also, I mean, there is now a movement, or let's say a movement, or some people with this trying to answer these questions from the UN in a group which is called Evaluation News. And maybe Julia can talk more about that, or Brian, but I leave it here so I don't take more time.
Thank you for that. Julian or Brian, did you want to come in? Yeah, go for it, Julia.
Yes, I mean, we are in a group where, as Adam was mentioning, evaluation use and the impact of it. And I think it's what we are trying to do is trying to identify indicators that are more suitable for delivering this impact, because one of the indicators people used to have in the past was, assessing the impact evaluation through the number of recommendations being implemented. But of course, that's challenging because it might create a perversive system of indicators, right? Where you just try to give as many recommendations as possible and trying to, address as many as possible in terms of quantity, but not in terms of quality. So what the group is trying to do is to look at more, what is the real change evaluations are producing? And this is where the impact should be focusing, right? Not the numbers. So there is this, we are discussing currently, how we are going to measure the change, because you also don't want to do an evaluation of the evaluation, right? But rather seeing a way that is easier in terms of how to identify the change. So I don't think the group is that far yet. They are identifying the change indicators they would like to bring. One way is to have a theory of change for evaluations, which would deliver, the desired impact at the beginning of the exercise. But I stop here because maybe there are other questions.
Mary, can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just to add quickly, I agree with everything Julie and Adam said to respond to the question. Two things. First, I think most evaluation units do their own, they do an external quality assessment. So that's one of the questions, how do we evaluate the evaluators? So something that we engage in, at least in OIOS. Second, the purpose of evaluation is generally twofold. It's not just, of course, we want to generate new insights and generate learning, but it's also for accountability. So a lot of things that come out of evaluations, although, some might say, oh, it's nothing new, it still has a value in terms of having a third party come in and do an assessment. So just cautioning, like when you see an evaluation, it's good in some ways that it reaffirms things that a program already knows, because that's a good sign that the program is being managed effectively. So it's not always going to be new or innovative, novel things. Thanks. Over.
Yeah. That's good to know. Yeah, also sometimes too, you find things that work, things that don't work, things that backfire as well. You don't know what you'll find. Great, thanks for that. Oh, Gina, I think needed to leave. So unfortunately, we couldn't hear final remarks from Gina, but I think we had a really full discussion today. We've already gone over time. There are more questions in the chat we can unpack, but we've already gone over our space here. But thank you so much for our panel for joining us. This is, I think, the start of probably many conversations to be had about this topic in the UN and outside. So it also too, if you want to share any links to the UN evaluation group, Adan, Julia, feel free to do so. And there's the behavioral science group I mentioned at the start if you haven't joined, do so already. And yeah, with that, thank you very much for being with us today and looking forward to seeing you later in the week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.